Hello everybody, thank you for joining us for today's video. We're going to keep talking about routine. Last episode we talked about the benefits of routine and the importance of routine, how it's good for our mental health and many other reasons it's good for our lives, so check that out if you haven't. Today we're going to talk about barriers to creating a routine or barriers to keeping a routine, and just some things that might make it difficult in life to be a more routine person, which Josh wouldn't know anything about. So what do you guys want to start with, the barriers to routine?
Well, so just a comment on that. I had this thought this morning as I was thinking about filming this. And I've probably shared this with you guys, but one of my biggest fears about being a therapist is being in session, like doing trauma work and having to pause to go to the bathroom, right? So I just go to the bathroom between every session.
Every session.
And one of my clients the other day, as I was on my way out, they were like, "Yeah, I know. Just go. I'll see you in your office." And I got thinking about it. Like, my routine probably drives my clients nuts. They're just sitting in there in my office by themselves until I get there. I'm like, oh my gosh, all of my people know my routine.
Well, think if they've seen you so many times, eventually they're going to catch on that you're like, I'm going to go to the bathroom, you just go to my office, I'll be right back.
Yep.
Right?
And that's exactly what she said. She's like, "I'll be in your office."
Yeah.
It was so funny. Anyway, I don't know. Just a funny segue. As therapists, what are some of the biggest things, or even just people in general, not with your clinical hat on, what do you see as being big barriers to routines?
Well, I think we touched bases about it a little bit last time, but like routines are not fun.
Yeah.
Right? And so I think sometimes it's hard to get up the motivation to actually do what it is that you know you need to be doing. Like, we know we need to be eating vegetables and going to bed at a decent hour and that sort of thing, but it's hard to get the motivation up to do that sometimes.
So over at my mother-in-law's house last night, she was cooking dinner. She had this whole cookie sheet of the most beautiful colored vegetables, and I was like, that looks really good, and I don't eat anything on that plate, right? Or on that tray. So yeah, sometimes routine just isn't fun. Like, I'm not ever going to trade in cookies for broccoli. It's just not going to happen.
Sure.
You know?
Well, and getting up the motivation to change it just can be really hard because, again, it can be a thought in your mind, but there's a big difference between, well, I'm thinking about this versus I'm actually going to go out and do it. Sometimes I'll look at my clients at the end of session and I'm like, so how likely are you to actually do this in your life? And a lot of times people are super honest and they'll just say, like maybe 20%, maybe 50%, right?
The other thing that I was thinking about in regards to this is just some of our own resistance to change. And when I think about my life, I do tend to go through these patterns of deciding that I'm going to eat healthy versus not. I notice a ton of resistance in my own self. Just because I'm like, I'm going to have to completely change my diet. It's going to take more time to cook. I have the biggest pantry full of crap in my life and all this leftover Christmas candy. I know it's only February, but I'm like, knowing that I'm going to have to purposefully say no to all of those things and have a protein shake that tastes like chalk.
Well, that's because you mix it with water. And it's expired.
The water's expired, or the
No,
protein?
the protein. I think, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, my point was, I think that oftentimes resistance to change is just a component of it too.
Yeah. Well, Cher mentioned like not finding the motivation to start a routine. And I think that when I think of me personally, I think that's always a really tough one. And sometimes I talk to clients about like motivation versus discipline. Right? When I think, Josh, you're probably a very disciplined person. But it doesn't I don't think anyone's really born that way. Right? It almost requires like some stretching and some working of that discipline muscle when you don't feel the motivation, to then like start reaping the benefits of the routine, so that it doesn't require that motivation, right? You can do it even if you don't feel that motivated, because motivation's kind of fickle.
Yeah, motivation is also one of the topics that I see regular with being a barrier to routine. Did you have a thought?
Well, I was just thinking that because earlier, well, I guess it was last year now, I read Atomic Habits. I don't know if you guys have read that book.
It's on my list.
But it's such a great book because it talks a lot about how if you want certain behaviors to happen, they have to be things that become routine. They have to be things that become habitual. Because if you're always just trying to talk yourself into doing a specific behavior, it's not going to happen. It's so much easier if you have something that's almost like you can go through it on autopilot. Like, this is just what happens next, right? So like for me at nighttime when I'm getting ready for bed, I always brush my teeth and then I wash my face and before I get in bed. That's just always the order that things go in. So I don't have to stop and think about it ahead of time. I don't have to have all of this like discipline or motivation to do it. Maybe it takes a little motivation to start the first thing, but after that, everything else is just triggered in order. You just go through it. And lots of times when we're trying to put some kind of a routine together, we don't have all of this structure. You can't do it on autopilot because you haven't done it like that before. And, you know, I think that book kind of illustrates some of this point. It's hard to build up like that motivation or discipline to get going. Once you have the routine in order and you're used to it, then you can do it on autopilot. But initially, it's really hard.
It makes me think, have you ever heard about, like, when they study people brushing their teeth? Like, you start brushing your teeth, like, in a few millimeters of where you start every single time.
Really?
Like, it's always in the same. Yeah. So thinking of that, like, into this routine idea, it kind of, like, makes me think, like, or the Atomic Habits idea. I guess I haven't read it either, but that's not something you think about, right? You don't think about that you start brushing your teeth in almost the exact same spot every single time you do it. But over time, it's just something you do, right? It just doesn't require any thought, which I imagine is much like a routine if you get really good at it.
I feel like that's just because that's where my toothbrush is.
What do you mean?
I mean, my toothbrush isn't going to be in the kitchen.
No, I mean like on the spot on your tooth.
Yeah, you put it on
Oh,
yeah.
a couple of millimeters.
I
on
totally
your
do.
tooth.
It's always the bottom right. That's where I start. That is so... I wonder how they measure that.
I don't know.
But it's got to be true, right? I mean,
Sure.
because you're totally on autopilot while you're doing something like brushing your teeth.
Oh, I'm on autopilot with how I dry myself off getting out of the shower. It's the same thing every time. Same routine, right?
Yeah, I do notice I do that too.
Do you?
Yeah.
You
don't want the towel to touch your butt, then your face.
Dude, never. Not... I swear we've had this conversation in my family a million times. So one thing that is worth noting is organization or lack of organization can be part of this. But before we do that, I am curious with Atomic Habits. Once let's say you find the motivation and you start creating some of these habits, do they talk about like a rough estimate of how long you have to be disciplined at something before it becomes a habit?
That's a really good question. I don't know that I can recall in the book what exactly they said. I've heard a lot of things about like 21 days or 28 days or
Same.
something like that. But the thing that I really like in Atomic Habits is that it's not really about getting the motivation to do something. It's about adding whatever you want to do on the end of a trigger, right? So like, let's say that I wanted to add something to my nighttime routine. It would be something that I would then just add on the end so that every time I finished brushing my teeth, then I would immediately do the next thing, whatever that is that I wanted to add into my routine. So that then it just becomes the thing that goes on autopilot again, right? Mm-hmm. You don't actually have to have the motivation up to do it. You just put it right against something else that's already part of a routine for you.
I like that idea because I think sometimes what's intimidating about routine is the idea that I'm going to have to rework my whole life schedule. I'm going to rework what time I wake up in the morning and how I approach my getting ready and all of those things, which seems overwhelming and maybe intimidating. But if I just think, well, maybe my nighttime routine is just brushing my teeth, right? So adding one thing onto that might not be so overwhelming or so complicated.
Right, and after you practice it multiple times, you really don't have to stop and get the motivation to do
Sure.
it. It just happens.
One of my biggest soapboxes about creating a routine when I work with people is kind of what you're just talking about, which is, in my mind, I view it as kind of an overcommitment, right? You make a New Year's resolution. I can't tell you how many times I've sat down and like, I'm going to read 50 books this year, right? It's 4 books a month. I can do that. Not even close to 50 books a year, right? But you overcommit to this idea of what you think you can do. And then you burn out really quickly because you make way too much change. If it were up to me, that's my personal vendetta against developing a routine, is I think we all do it way too much and way too fast at the same time. But that's just my personal.
There's probably some truth to that because I think many times in my life I have been like started going to the gym and then stopped going to the gym within like probably 3 to 6 months. But over the past couple of years, I've been really consistent. Mostly because I think when I first started, my goal was to go 3 times a week for 20 minutes, which I don't know how much work you're going to get done in 20 minutes at the gym, but it was more than zero.
Sure.
And if I wanted to stay longer, I could, but on the days I didn't want to be there, I could tell myself, oh, I've been 20 minutes, I can go home. And working my way from that was a lot more effective for me than I'm going to go from not working out to 5 days a week for an hour a day or something like that.
Easing your way into it.
Mhm.
That really helped.
I'm curious, taking it back to what we threw out there a little bit ago, what do you guys think or see regarding the idea of disorganization? Do you think being disorganized plays into a challenge with routine? And like what percentage of people with no routines struggle with disorganization? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I would assume they go very hand in hand.
Yeah.
Disorganization and lack of routine.
What about
From personal experience.
What about like an ability to become organized, which I guess in some ways is creating that routine. It's being disciplined, right? Do they have to go hand in hand?
It's a good question.
What do you think? What do you think about that?
I don't know. I think I'm too far removed from the situation. Like I don't
From
know.
disorganization
Well,
and lack of routine.
I don't want it to sound that way. Probably too far removed from lack of routine, but the idea. This is totally terrible to admit online. Maybe we edit this out. But sometimes when I think of folks who struggle with ADHD, I'm like, just get it together. But I recognize cognitively that it's not that easy. But I think I'm just so far removed from waking up and wondering, okay, I'll share this one. My wife will probably hate me for this. Shortly after we had our little boy, I asked her, I'm like, what are you going to do today? And she's like, we'll see what the day brings. And that was like grinding gears for me. Like, what do you mean we'll see what the day brings? That makes no sense. Like, tell the day what to bring. And I don't want to sound like...
You've never been at home with a baby, apparently.
Well, I've learned in a couple of years, like, I'm not the boss of my house, nor is she. My
Sure.
little boy is the boss of the house, right? But she has just lived her life previous to having a baby that was like, well, whatever the day brings, like maybe my sister will come over, or maybe we'll go this and that. And I'm like, if you want to go swimming, like, you choose to go swimming, right? So I think I'm really removed from that part of like the routine, but disorganization, like, I don't know that I'm the most organized person on the planet. It's like I can understand the disorganization, but maybe they do have to go hand in hand. I don't know.
Well, listening to your story, I think, thinking of my own relationship, I think sometimes routine can, maybe another barrier can be the other person being so routine, right? I almost feel like I have to be a certain amount flexible because my wife does like her routine.
Mm-hmm.
And so that requires me to also not have a conflicting routine, right?
Sure.
And working in a field like this where my schedule is not always the same week to week or day to day, where I get to kind of pick my own schedule, but maybe people cancel or there's whatever, right? I think it's frustrating for her sometimes that my
Sure.
schedule is not so consistent because she likes to be like have her routine. But then I also wonder maybe if I was more routined, would that cause problems? Would our routines conflict, and that would be bad.
Maybe, huh? That's interesting.
Yeah, if my wife decided that she wanted to take the morning exercise time frame,
Yeah.
and so I needed to be home, I would like discombobulate, right?
Yeah, or what if she wanted to exercise like right before, like right during dinner time, right? And all of a sudden your routine's different. You got to cook dinner and have your son, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Something like that, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I always think about, when I think about setting up some kind of a routine, I kind of think about it as like the structure that you're setting for your day. And then within the structure of that, you can have space for all kinds of things, right?
Like mini routines.
Well, and I don't even know that it's like mini routines. Like, I noticed that my brain kind of just sets up this structure. Like, here's the time for exercise in the morning. And I don't usually have a plan of what it is that I'm going to do for exercise in the morning. I let myself do whatever I want during, maybe I'm going to run, maybe I'm going to lift weights, maybe whatever. But the structure is there. So sometimes I think that people think that if you have like a routine, that means that you have no freedom of choice. Suddenly it's like every single thing is already decided for you and completely organized. But I actually think that there can be quite a bit of flexibility. It's just that you have this initial structure set up and then you can do whatever you want within that structure. I don't know if that makes sense. But as we're talking about like the difference between being organized versus routine, I think that some of it we kind of need to look at it in this way. The routine is the structure of your day, but then so many things can happen inside of that, and you can make space for lots of different choices. It's just that you have the initial structure.
Yeah, maybe that's kind of an issue with kind of the nature of the word routine, and maybe like some of the association with it, right? Routine, when we talk about it in a negative light, maybe it comes across as like obsessive, when in reality routine is more flexible than we're giving the word credit for. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That it is just like a framework of your day.
One of the things that I was looking at in preparing for this episode was that one of the barriers to routine is a lack of flexibility. And so the idea would be actually be more flexible within your routine. And I think you worded that really well. Exercise is from 6 to 7 a.m., but what I do in that 6 to 7 a.m. can be flexible. One of the things I always find a little bit comical is all of us in the mornings at the gym complain when there's a lot of people there. It's like, well,
Is there a lot of people at the gym at 3 in the morning when you go?
The gym's even open at 3
Yeah.
They don't open that early, nor would I go that early.
No,
Okay.
4 is plenty early.
Yeah.
But you walk in there and we all complain about it. We're like, well, I was gonna do back today, but I guess I'm not. But it's actually probably better for the body to not even be super routined in that, according to some of the research I've seen.
Right.
But
I'm just thinking about one more barrier to routines that's kind of an interesting idea. In treatment for kids who've been through trauma, one of the very first things that you're supposed to do and help the family do is come up with some routines. There has to be some structure for the child so that there is predictability. And this can actually be really super hard for families to set up. It can be really super hard for the child to adhere to. But sometimes the hardest thing about building a routine is just you not having had a routine in the past.
Sure.
Right? Trying to make that change from not having a routine to having a routine now. Because if that's not how you were raised, you weren't raised in a household where there was routine, it actually feels so foreign. Your body really almost craves going back to all of that unpredictability because it's so familiar. And so just not having had a routine as a child can actually make it really difficult as an adult to come up with and implement a routine because it is so foreign. It's just kind of an interesting thing to think about. Sometimes it has nothing to do with your motivation or your determination or your organization, none of those things. It's about what it is that you've experienced in the past.
I would totally agree with that. Creating something new can feel so weird if you've not had experience with it before. I think routine's no exception to that.
Yeah. Anytime you're making a change, whether it's negative or positive change, if it's new, it's uncomfortable.
Well, and maybe even like a little more than just like uncomfortable. It's like so foreign, right? It's just so different. It almost feels wrong. I know I've talked to a lot of people that for them, when I say, hey, look, let's get you like a decent like bedtime and wake up time, that feels so foreign because as a kid, they were the kind of kid who was, wandering around the house until they got too tired and so they fell asleep next to the fridge, right? Like
That like boggles my mind.
Right, but that's because you have had such a strict routine throughout your life. And so thinking about doing something like that has to feel so foreign to you, right? The idea of like, oh, I would just wander around the house until I get tired and fall asleep in a random place. For you, how hard of a change would that be if I was asking you to go that direction?
Astronomical.
Right, but see, I would say moving the opposite direction for the person who had that kind of childhood would feel that astronomical.
For sure.
It would feel that difficult because it is just so foreign. So sometimes I think we have to give ourselves a little bit of grace. Like you said, this needs to be a little more of a gradual shift. It can't just be a all at once kind of a thing because your body will be so rejecting of it.
That's so true. I already feel the resistance to that whole concept right now. And that's not even on the table for me, so.
It makes me want to like make you try it just once, see what would happen.
Well, anything else you guys want to add about this before we wrap it up?
I don't think so. I think we covered a lot of different barriers. Maybe just notice what barriers seem to fit in your personality style, and just develop an awareness about it.
Yeah, and along with awareness, this just has to be a gradual shift. So be patient with yourself. do it slowly, right? Start with 20 minutes at the gym 3 times a week as opposed to every single day, so that you're not overcommitting and burning out.
Perfect. Well, thanks everybody for joining us for today's video. If you liked it, please leave a comment and subscribe, and we'd love to talk to you guys, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thanks.
See you next week.